Hi, how's everyone doing? Good. I had a gluten-free donut and it was so good and I was so pleasantly surprised. So my night is going great. Um, so my name is Rose Judge. This is my first Donut.js and I'm really excited to be here. Today I'm going to discuss Git disasters in open source and specifically dive into an experience that I had earlier last year. I'll briefly talk about how we can in general respond to Git disasters and then mechanisms maybe that we can put in place to prevent them from happening in the first place. So a little bit about me. I joined VMware last year as a co-maintainer for a project called Turn, and Turn is an open source tool that inventories container images. Another fun fact about me is that within my first 3 months at VMware, I overwrote the Git merge history on master for Turn for about 80 commits. So more on that later, but fun fact. Okay, so often when we think of open source, and maybe some of you work in open source, or maybe you dabble in it, or maybe you never have, but you've heard of it, you've probably heard of kind of some promises that get advertised when people throw around the term open source. So you get to work on projects that interest you and build a portfolio of skills. You get to work with other talented developers that maybe aren't at your company or that you wouldn't otherwise. And in the process, you get to show off your skills. And this is true, but there's also kind of this silent disclaimer that doesn't really get talked about in the context of open source. And that is that while mistakes are inevitable, they're also in the public domain and everybody sees them happen. And because of Git, they're there forever. So open source is a collaborative process, and because of this, if you're contributing or maintaining open source projects, sometimes your mistakes can be amplified in ways that you may not even realize or understand. And because of this kind of elevated impact of risk, we'll call it, when you participate in open source, it can sometimes feel like a monumental challenge to address the implications of a Git disaster. So when I say Git disaster, these are a few examples that it could mean. When it comes to Git disasters, it's kind of a choose your own adventure ride. So use your imagination, but you could rewrite Git commit history like I did. You could push or delete unwanted changes to master. You could push sensitive secrets to a public repository. Or maybe it's not even a mistake necessarily, but you incorporate changes into the project that have suddenly have unintended consequences and breaks downstream consumers' code. So the Git disaster world is your oyster. Do with it what you will. But I think I can best explain kind of how this works with a story. So this on the left is the list of commits for which I overwrote the commit history. There's so many of them here. I didn't even count them, but I estimated about 80. You can barely see them. And at the time, I was trying to update my forked copy of Turn, which to match with master, and obviously was not being careful enough because I switched origin to master at some point and repushed all the commits from my local branch, which luckily was updated to master, as you can see here. So once this happened, I immediately went into disaster recovery mode. And for me, this looked like just trying to figure out if commits were missing, if I had erased anything, and what that was. And then once I deduced that I don't think I did, running basic touch tests to make sure that everything still works as it had been at the head of master. So after these basic checks, I could see no commits were lost. Obviously, it wasn't ideal to have rewritten them, but once I did that basic disaster recovery, I could dive a little deeper into how it happened and potentially preventing it in the future. So what can you do when you make or commit a Git disaster? This is my dog. This is a real situation I came home to one day. And also what I imagine Turn's GitHub commit history looked like after I rewrote it on accident. So Okay, so you've made a mistake. Before you can take a step towards finding a solution, you need to understand what went wrong and why. And the answer for what went wrong could be, I know I'm not supposed to do that. It was just a mistake, or I wasn't paying attention, or it could be like, I have no idea what went wrong, but let me go find out. But there really needs to be a true understanding of how things went wrong in order to move forward to the next step of finding a solution. So the best advice I can offer you is that it's a waste of time to dwell in your mistakes. Yes, you want to understand what went wrong, but spending an extended amount of time feeling embarrassed or mad at yourself or sad is just time that you could be using to move forward towards a solution. And while the solution may look like trying to get out of this maze and near impossible, just taking that first step, big or small, is important. So in my situation, part of moving forward towards finding a solution was notifying any contributors who had open pull requests that they're going to need to rebase their commits. Yeah, so like any kind of mistake you make in life, in the end, the only thing that you can really do is learn from it. The best way I think that you can demonstrate to your peers that you understand what is wrong is by suggesting and putting mechanisms in place to prevent the mistakes from happening in the future. So how can you do this? The answer will vary based on the situation, but I will offer a few checks and balances at least for Git disasters. And the first is Git hooks. Git hooks are a great check for all things Git related. They are built-in utilities to the .git/hooks directory in every project that you check out. They're typically shell scripts that can be customized to follow rules that you set. And some particular hooks that I found helpful are, at least for this presentation, are pre-commit and pre-push. Pre-commit hooks run before anything is committed, and they inspect the commit pending snapshot. This can be a great tool to lint your code for spelling errors or your commit messages. Pre-push hooks are run prior to the transfer of any data to the Git repository on a push command. So these can be really handy to include checks about like which branch you're pushing to. I've seen multiple projects utilize them to check if like secrets are being pushed or phrases or words that they don't want there. And yeah, like I said, it's a shell script, so you can kind of dictate what it's looking for. I currently have my pre-push hook set to warn me anytime I force push anything, whether it's a branch that I want to force push to or not. And there are ways that you can work around it, but it's kind of a nice reminder nice sanity check to make sure that what I'm doing actually makes sense. In addition to Git hooks, there's also just this really lovely, simple hack in your local environment that you can enforce. And basically, it's renaming the upstream push URL to something that's not a valid URL. So I set mine to, hey, stop pushing upstream. So this way, even if I wanted to push to master, Git would say, I can't push to, hey, stop pushing upstream. And that would remind me, oh yeah, like, do I really want to do this? If I do, then I can always go change this URL back to what it was before. So it's just another good sanity check. Okay, so to summarize, a couple ways that you can learn from your mistakes is to debrief the situation. And you can do this with yourself or with a coworker or a trusted mentor. But some questions that I like to ask are, what happened? And again, being specific and honest with yourself. How did this happen? And how can I prevent this from happening in the future? And then once you debrief, don't forget to congratulate yourself for living through it. Okay, so maybe you didn't commit the Git disaster and you're on the other side of it, meaning that you've watched someone make a mistake and you're tasked with kind of overseeing the cleanup. This is my personal advice from experience. And the most important being really basic, but something that I think can be overlooked is that empathy is key. If you're working with a human being, they're already going to feel bad about the mistake that they made. You don't need to take it upon yourself to do that. Ask yourself how you would respond to your mom or your dad or your maybe your parents aren't good examples, but your like, I don't know, your sister, somebody that you care deeply for, and ask if you would, or how you would respond, right? And then try to offend or involve the offender. Don't offend the involver, involve the offender, and in finding a solution. It can be tempting when you have a bunch of stuff to do and you have to deal with a mess to kind of pick up the broom and clean it up yourself, but they're not children. And if they're capable of causing a Git disaster, they're capable of cleaning it up. So doing the work for them doesn't allow them to learn anything from it. And it certainly won't help prevent this kind of mistake from happening in the future. So the third point, which I've kind of mentioned already, but is that a Git disaster can be a great opportunity to reevaluate your workflows and ask yourself how this happened in the first place. And the answer will vary based on the situation, but some good places to start are looking at GitHub protected branches, which can prevent certain collaborators from making certain changes, increasing your CI code coverage, and expanding your documentation, particularly with examples of maybe how someone got into that situation in the first place. And then sometimes when you're cleaning up the aftermath of a mistake, it can be frustrating. It's easy to get mad. It can be tempting to default to blame or scolding. But in the end, it's not going to get you very far. Brené Brown, you may have heard of her, but she's a famous shame researcher. And this is a quote from one of her books, Daring Greatly. And so as you can read for yourself or see for yourself, is shame breeds fear. It crushes tolerance for vulnerability, thereby killing engagement, innovation, creativity, productivity, and trust. And I just think that this is one of the best ways to sum this up. This is not just a nice, like, feel-good quote that she came up with. It's evidence from years of research about shame in the workplace and at home. And I think the more you can avoid triggering a shame spiral in yourself and others, the further you're going to get faster towards finding a solution. So I know I've touched on a bunch of stuff in a short amount of time, but I think if you take anything away from this, it all boils down to these 3 points, which are open source, or really any software for that matter. It runs because of the work done by imperfect people. Mistakes will be an inherent part of the process. And when they happen, it's important to remind yourself of that. And also, we can all learn something from mistakes, right? We can all improve in the aftermath of a mistake, and we can all be better after it. And then again, I just invite you to ask yourself, whether you're the offender or the observer, how you would respond if you saw someone that you care deeply for make the same mistake. And my guess is that you're going to be a lot kinder, a lot gentler, a lot more patient than you would give to yourself or coworkers. So I think just being aware of your reaction is the first step towards changing the way we deal with Git disasters and mistakes in general. So thank you.